was one is to wait until I was given the choice as a children.
Hello everybody and welcome to Hall 7, home of the Conservative Environment Network for the duration of this party conference. For those that don't know, my name is Kitty Thompson. I'm the Senior Nature Programme Manager here at the Conservative Environment Network, and I'm so glad to see you all in the room this morning. So, thank you for joining us for this panel, which is entitled Pastures New, How Can We Protect Our Natural Inheritance? And I'm so grateful for today's sponsors, the Woodland Trust and the National Trust, for making this event a possibility. Before we get into our panellists' opening remarks, I'll just do a bit of housekeeping. So each of our panellists will give 3 minutes of introductory remarks, and then we will hand over to audience Q&A. I am looking for questions rather than statements. Please keep that in the forefront of your mind throughout. And then we will wrap up at about 11:30. Before I hand over to our panellists, I will just say a little bit of background about the topic. So, the UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world, and our natural inheritance is in danger in many ways of being lost. This island has seen the gradual disappearance and degradation of precious habitats, but I think we're now waking up to the consequences of this loss of biodiversity. We now have a legally binding target to halt the decline of nature in the UK by 2030. So this makes this new Parliament a make-it-or-break-it moment for nature. Since taking office, Labour has already prioritised pro-development planning reforms and proposed a cut to the nature-friendly farming budget. The Conservative Party in opposition must hold the government to account on its environmental promises, while shaping a clear, compelling vision for nature from the opposition benches. But that's enough from me. I will now hand over to our first panellist, which is Theresa Villiers, former Member of Parliament for Chipping Barnet and former Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and a very proactive member of SEN's Parliamentary Caucus. Theresa.
Thank you, Kitty. Well, it's great to be here with SEN at the Conservative Party conference, and thank you all for coming to the conference. It's a pretty gruelling thing, so I imagine we're all a bit exhausted if we've been here a few days. And naturally, the focus of much of our attentions this week is on the leadership race, and I sincerely hope that all our 4 wonderful leadership candidates make a real commitment on protecting the natural environment and handing it on in a better state than we found it. But of course, it's not just about what our new leader is going to be saying about this. Our job as opposition is to hold the new government to account, and they are subject to commitments on nature as well, not least the 2030 target that Kitty's just mentioned to end species decline. So we need to hold them to that, and we must not let their rush to build mean that nature becomes a casualty. Yes, of course, we need to deliver new homes and improved infrastructure, but the impact of each of these projects on the natural environment does need to be properly considered. We mustn't have planning reforms that just railroad such projects through without regard to the consequences. And I'm really worried about Labour's plan to release greenbelt land for development. I think it will damage our ability to deliver our commitments on nature. And the fact is, even when it's not scenic or attractive or conventionally beautiful, greenbelt land can still be the home of crucial natural habitats for wildlife, supporting wildlife corridors in suburban and urban areas. And the idea of allowing development where land is previously developed or amounts to so-called grey belt does have a very serious flaw. It will provide an incentive for developers to buy up greenbelt land on a speculative basis and run it down with vehicles, unapproved haulage containers, fly tipping, in the hope that it's going to become ugly enough that it becomes treated as grey belt land. It's actively encouraging irresponsible behaviour. And I know, obviously, there are important provisions in the law which are vital for nature conservation, which will be helpful, like biodiversity net gain. But there are certain habitats which it is more or less impossible to re-provide in other places, not least many types of woodland. I do hope that the government will listen carefully and will not seek to erode local input into decision-making on planning applications. It's somewhat depressing to see Michael Gove's NPPF reforms being dismantled. They would have given communities back a greater say over planning decisions without undermining our efforts to build. And I genuinely believe that empowering communities doesn't mean that nothing gets built. The experience of neighbourhood planning shows that if people have agency and power and involvement, they can be quite ambitious about the provision of new homes. I'll close, though, on 2 points. Firstly, we really need to ensure that the process of compiling and updating what's known as local nature recovery strategies is meaningful. They were introduced by the Environment Act. They could do a tremendous amount of good if they are taken seriously. And secondly, it is absolutely crucial that we maintain the farm support budget which the Conservatives had committed to. It is deeply worrying to see that under threat. The ELM schemes and the sustainable farming incentive that are being delivered through the farm support scheme are crucial in restoring the natural environment. And I believe that they are one of the most positive legacies of the outgoing Conservative government. We need to fight to ensure that they continue to be properly funded if we are to live up to our reputation as Conservatives focused on conserving nature and tackling the hugely worrying depletion of nature in our country.
Thank you so much, Theresa. Next up, we have Ben Goldsmith. Ben, you have many hats. I'm not quite sure which one to call upon this morning, but I'll go with the chair of the Conservative Environment Network.
Thank you so much, Kitty. I think something big has changed in the last 5 or 7 years in this country and everywhere. And that is a kind of growing yearning on the part of all people for more nature in their lives. I don't know whether it was the insane lockdowns or the time people spent locked at home and confined to the immediate vicinity of where they live, or what actually has happened. But people really want nature back. And that poll after poll shows that it's not a left-right thing, it's not a rural-urban thing, it's not a young-old thing, it's not a rich-poor thing, it's a universal thing. The numbers are absolutely enormous in terms of the proportion of people that are demanding action now to have nature back. And if you speak to journalists at the BBC or the Telegraph, or the popularity of stories reporting on the reintroduction of white storks in Sussex, or the role of beavers in protecting people from flooding, these are hugely popular stories. So this is the zeitgeist, and it's not only going one way, there's no doubt. And just at this moment where people have sort of unleashed this longing, we realise that our country is one of the most nature-depleted countries on earth. We rank alongside Ireland, Malta, Kuwait, Iceland, as the bottom 10 or 20 most nature-depleted countries on earth, as far as ecosystem intactness, wildlife abundance, and so on go. What we know is that it comes back very quickly, much quicker than people think. You establish a marine protected area, and you genuinely protect it from the most harmful forms of fishing and bottom trawling and so on, and life explodes. Michael Bloomberg described this as the greatest J-curve in the world, and this is the recovery of nature if you just take your foot from off its throat. And when you walk to the railway station afterwards, you'll see there's little weeds and grasses growing through the cracks in the pavement. Nature wants to recover. It doesn't require that much to bring it back, and it happens very fast. You don't have to wait a lifetime. A few short months or years and things start to happen. So we as a country, I think, have embraced generally this idea of bringing nature back everywhere, rewilding in the cities, and people are changing the way they manage their gardens, and an end to mowing road verges, saving money for taxpayers by letting the wildflowers bloom and the pollinators feed alongside railways and roads and so on. We've also committed internationally in Montreal in 2021 to restore 30% of our land and 30% of our sea to a healthy state by 2030. That's a massive undertaking. Depending on who you talk to, somewhere between perhaps 4 and 10% of our land is in a good ecological state now. So we've got to get to 30% by 2030. And not only do we promise to do so internationally, we were the ones that bullied all the other countries of the world to do this. We used our full diplomatic strength to march people into the room and get them to sign on the dotted line. So we kind of have to do it now. We've also, as Theresa told us, we've also committed in law here domestically in the Environment Act and so on to restore nature, and there's a bunch of ratcheting targets, and there's an ombudsman now, Office for Environmental Protection, that has real power to make sure we do that. So we've got to restore nature in a pretty comprehensive way. There's no wriggling out of it. And we've put a bunch of the tools in place under the last government to do that. The Environmental Land Management Scheme is a triumph, a global triumph. The only country that's done anything similar is Costa Rica, and they increased forest cover from 20% to 60% in one generation. Costa Rica was the inspiration for the Environmental Land Management Scheme. We got biodiversity net gain, which is far from perfect, but it opens the pathway to a lot of private sector money for nature recovery. And generally, it's a policy that's been embraced by developers, and they've been very helpful in bringing it about. What we've really got to do, though, is we've got to comprehensively bring back wild places in a bunch of core areas. You can't have nature unless you have some core areas, some refuges where you have self-willed, real functional ecosystems of the kind that you find in virtually any country you might have visited this summer. If you went to Spain, Asturias, the Cantabrian Mountains, you went to Italy, the whole spine of Italy. If you go to Switzerland, you go to France, they have these core areas in which there is a certain wildness, a certain self-willed appearance to nature. And if we're going to do that, we have to do it in our national parks. And there are three arguments against restoring nature comprehensively in our national parks. The first is food. How are we going to feed ourselves? If we reduce or cease farming in our protected landscapes, our remoter landscapes, we'll all starve. And those of us that don't starve will be eaten by beavers and wolves. It's a nonsense. This argument is a nonsense. The National Food Strategy Report, which was drafted by Henry Dimbleby when I was at DEFRA, says that 85% of the food in this country, more or less, comes from about 20% of the land. And as far as I'm aware, no one is asking to rewild that land. So approximately 15% of the food we produce comes from all the rest, 80%. And the least productive, 20 to 25% of the land, produces somewhere between 1% and 3% of the food. So these are not productive landscapes. So the food security argument is kind of nonsense. If we could theoretically, and no one is suggesting this, we could theoretically cease farming in our national parks altogether, and it wouldn't make a dent in national food security. As an aside, if we're interested in national food security, we need to look at food waste. We need to look at using hundreds of thousands of hectares of prime agricultural land to grow not food for people, but food for machines of bioenergy, which we then call green, or plastering them with solar panels, or building golf courses, or putting out ponies. If we really are serious about food security, let's use the best land to grow food for people, and let's not waste it. In 1970, we wasted probably 20% of the food. Today, it's somewhere between 40 and 50%. So the food argument is nonsense when it comes to restoring core wild areas in Bodmin, Dartmoor, Exmoor, the Somerset Levels, the Pennines, the Lake District, the Yorkshire Dales, and so on. The second argument is economy, livelihoods, and the economic aspect of ceasing farming in these landscapes. Well, the average age of farmers in our national park is more than 70. The young generation really don't want to do this. Monoculture of sheep in our national parks is not serving anyone from an economic perspective. No one's making a decent living. I remember seeing figures from DEFRA which showed that the average take-home net annual income of a sheep farmer in our national parks is about £8,000, which is miles less than the national living wage. And it's really it's a crap living from an economic perspective, as compared with how they use the uplands economically in Spain, Italy, France. Diversity of activities, the agroecological hotel, a little bit of food, birdwatch guiding, bit of timber, and people generally have a bunch of different things going on in their lives, not just one, which is sheep. The third argument is culture, and I think this is a real argument, and it's the most genuine argument, and it is the main obstacle to restoring core areas of nature in our protected landscapes. And that is, people in these landscapes are really afraid of the big change that they feel is inevitably coming, and they're right to be afraid. It is a frightening thing. And they deserve to have support in a kind of to take a kind of newspeak, a kind of just transition to a different way of managing the land. And they need to be reassured that they don't need to stop farming. We need books like Wilding by Isabella Tree and countless scientific studies have shown we need heavy grazing animals in the landscape if we're going to recover these mosaics of woodland and wetland and semi-open savanna wood pasture. If we're going to get the best ecological outcomes, we need heavy grazing animals, which means a gentle transition away from sheep ranching, which is quite a recent phenomenon. There were about 1 million sheep in all of the British Isles, including Ireland, when Beatrix Potter settled in the Lake District. Today there's somewhere around 40 million, depending on the time of year. So we need to transition away from monocultures of sheep to a gentler, more traditional way of farming with native cattle, small numbers of animals, and a diversity of economic activities. And then we can have it all. That is the silver bullet. We can have the culture of farming in these landscapes. We can have a better economic life for these people and greater security, and we can have tremendously vibrant nature. So I think this is the great challenge as Conservatives, is to present this fair and decent and conservative plan for restoring nature in our national parks without removing people from their livelihoods.
Thank you so much, Ben. You covered a lot of ground there, and I'm sure we'll pick up a few of those points as well in the Q&A. Next up, I have Hilary McGrady. Hilary is the Director General of the National Trust. To you.
Morning, everyone. And he's just said everything that I was planning to say. Slightly annoying, but anyway, no, thank you, Ben. And thank you, Sen, for enabling this today. It's really, really important conversation. First thing I wanted to start with was this. I think there's one of them sitting probably on your chair, and in case you're in any doubt, this is the Sycamore Gap tree, it was a year ago this week that this was cut down. Now, tragic as that was, it was without doubt tragic. What it did do, and it plays to what Ben was saying, it did demonstrate just the level of passion that our communities in the round feel for nature. This was by far and away, from a National Trust point of view, certainly, and I think most people would naturally recognise that, it was an outpouring of absolute love for our natural and our cultural heritage that continues to rumble on, and I'm sure you saw the coverage we got last week. So in terms of being in any doubt that nature matters to the people of the UK, this was just one illustration of that. But you're quite right, Ben. We know it and we see it every day. Really, COVID did bring it into real life situations where people were desperate to get out into green space, desperate to engage with nature. And there's so many bits of research now to demonstrate just how important a really healthy natural environment is to all of our lives in all senses. And I'll come back to that sense of in the round why this matters. In terms of today, and the question that I guess I was asked maybe was, and what is the role of the Conservative Party now in opposition to continue on the legacy that you set so brilliantly, actually, in many respects? If you think back over the last, certainly, decade, we've already mentioned it, the 25-year Environment Plan, the Environment Act, the net zero targets, and actually these things go together, by the way. And you know from your own research that this matters to your constituents, it matters to your voters. I think I was at a session yesterday, 74% of people said that this climate change in particular matters, and of course nature is a very easy way into climate change. So the legacy that the Conservative Party set is one that needs to be built on, and I know there's a huge sense of pride around that. So I guess the question is then, well, what needs to happen? Well, I would start actually with the farmers, and I've sat through several sessions now over the last few days about looking at everything from food security to their overall sustainability. What I would say is we definitely need to hold this government's feet to the fire to get the money out the door that has already been committed. For the life of me, I can't understand why it's still sat there, and the farmers are desperate, NGOs are desperate to get their hands on that money to make the difference that could be made quickly. And time is something that has come up again over the last few days, but we've got time. We don't have time. Nature is in such catastrophic decline that we must act, and we must act now. And that money is currently there and it needs to get out the door. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is that there isn't enough money, and we, along with several other RSPB, Woodland Trust and others, did a piece of research to say, well, how much money do we think we do need to reverse the decline in nature? And we estimate it's something like 5.9 billion. That's more money actually going to the farmers. And while I agree with you that there's, and you've covered the detail around who needs to farm and whatever, what I do firmly believe is they do still manage over 80% of the land out there. So they need support to enable nature to thrive. So not only does that money need to get out the door, we need more money, not less. And then a third point, which I think did come up this morning, actually, in the session before this, there is something about bureaucracy that is getting in the way here. Now, what I fundamentally didn't agree with was the bashing of Natural England or the Environment Agency. That's not helpful. It is really not helpful. In fact, I would say they don't have enough bodies on the ground to enable the decisions to be made. We are in this together, and this is a whole system approach, which is the one thing I would definitely be asking for. I did happened to be sitting in a session a couple of weeks ago with DEFRA officials, and for the first time there were planning people in there as well. So there was a cross department conversation going on, and I would extend that actually into health and a number of other departments that need to start to think of this in the round, because there isn't a world whereby nature doesn't underpin all of our lives. So the idea that you can separate it into being a DEFRA thing just doesn't make sense to me. So I would just finish on that sense of why it matters that you engage the public far and wide. And then the final piece is, and this isn't just about rural communities, while the Conservative Party are thought about or think of themselves potentially around being a rural-based party, actually the vast majority of people live in our towns and cities. And if we don't find a way to engage the public, all of the public, in why nature matters, reconnect them with what they eat and where it comes from, we're all lost, actually. So that element of public engagement and really ensuring that people do understand why it matters and what part they can play seems to me fundamental. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last but by no means least, we have Abby Bunker, and Abby is the Director of Conservation and External Affairs at the Woodland Trust. Over to you, Abby.
Lovely, thank you. Lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me along. My name's Abby Bunker. I work at the Woodland Trust. So I will talk a bit about trees and woodlands. To add to colleagues, I'll try and add a bit more rather than repeat. I think there has been there is a legacy for Conservative that have been achieved, particularly over the last Conservative governments. I mean, you mentioned the Environment Act, but also Health and Harmony. Does anyone remember Health and Harmony, which was Michael Gove's direction set for the future of farming payments post-Brexit? Really groundbreaking to embed public money for public goods. A bit of momentum has been lost since that was kicked off, but really very vital. And initiatives like changing the National Planning Policy Framework. In 2018, we were delighted to see the changes undertaken, as Theresa has talked about, to make ancient woodlands and ancient and veteran trees give them greater protection in planning policy, and only in wholly exceptional circumstances should they be put at risk. And finally, things like the Nature for Climate Fund, which has been such a vital fund to drive landscape scale change, in particular tree planting, but also woodland restoration at scale. And it's really been able to kickstart. It was important funding for things like the Northern Forest, that Woodland Trust and partners in the Community Forest Trust across the northern landscapes have been able to do so much. And it really is vital to build on this. I would also add, I think I'd like to recognise the importance of SEN in terms of making sure that the efforts and successes of the previous Conservative governments are still there and are very much part of the leadership contest. Recent letter to the Telegraph and a statement recently from former PMs is also great to see. To add to what Hilary's just talked about in terms of the Sycamore Gap, we saw at the Woodland Trust that had a massive impact and uptick in support for our campaign on living legends and making the case for greater legal protection for some of our ancient veteran trees. You may have heard of, those of you who live in the southeast of England, the Caversham oak. I think it's also known as the King's Spy oak. This is a beautiful tree that is at least 400-500 years old. It was around, and it's called the King's Spy oak, as apparently parliamentary units used it to sight the royalist forces approaching. Now, this sits in the back garden of a end-of-terrace house in Caversham and was the subject of a massive campaign in 2023. So this is after the changes to the MPPF, which should have seen only in wholly exceptional circumstances that such trees should have been under threat. It was going to be felled and apparently replaced, so the developer proposed, by 2 other trees in the front and the back gardens in order to build a fairly nondescript bungalow. Thankfully, the Woodland Trust and many local campaigners fought very hard, and that application was not approved. Now, it feels to me like we do need to see more planning, we do need to see more housing, of course, across the country, but wasting time within the planning system with a case like that, it feels to us that really we should be making it much clearer that such significant parts of our natural inheritance should not be on the table. And I think, just thinking about what needs to happen, to add to what others have said, investment through the farming schemes, such as the environmental land management schemes, but also the landscape recovery schemes, is absolutely vital for us to realise our ambitions on nature recovery, making sure that the planning system doesn't go backwards, that in actual fact we build on some of the real successes and changes that previous Tory governments have been able to see, and holding them to account so that we don't damage nature. And also, I think the vital opportunity to bring new private funding into nature restoration is incredibly important. As Ben has talked about, the biodiversity net gain, it's not perfect. I think there's going to need to be some really important role of government in ensuring that we don't see a greenwash, that is really fit for purpose, it's credible, robust, and delivers on its outcomes. And I think we in opposition, the Conservative Party, can really hold the government to account on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Abby. And before I turn to your questions, but please do get thinking of them, I wanted to ask firstly Theresa about some of the politics of what's being discussed. So, for example, Ben's point on the National Food Strategy has good information on where is producing what amount of calories, but that obviously on the ground when talking to the farmers presents potentially some political challenges. And I wondered, from your time in government, what you could enlighten us on.
Well, that's an extremely tough question to kick off with. I find if Ben and I probably don't completely agree on these issues. But I think where we do have common ground is we've got to find a way to bring farmers with us on this journey. And that's for reasons of food security, but also those cultural reasons which Ben rightly talked about. I believe that there is a way to do this, but certainly I have reservations about some of the sort of the rush for rewilding that we've seen happen. So I think there is a need for compromise. There is a need to do this in a gradual way, but absolutely there are ways to make our farming landscapes and the way we farm in this country far more nature friendly, and we've made a good step along that road by creating the elm schemes, but there is a lot further to go, and that will involve some difficult processes before we get to that right balance which ensures that we don't jeopardise food security but also conserves those rural traditions and livelihoods which are so important to us.
Thank you. I also wanted to pick up on Ben's point about people yearning for nature, and I think that's totally true. I know that the two organisations to my right have done so much work on access to nature, but I wondered how, Ben, you think we could reconcile that with the idea of shifting baseline syndrome. How can we be the world's most nature-depleted country and expect people to know what nature they should want access to? It might be worth explaining what that syndrome is.
Yeah, yes. Shifting baseline syndrome, it's used to describe the phenomenon whereby we yearn for the kind of nature abundance we knew as children, without realising that when we were children it was already dramatically depleted as compared with our parents' experience or our grandparents' experience. And there are a handful of quite famous now eyewitness accounts of nature in the 19th and 18th centuries. A guy called Oliver Goldsmith, no relation, stood on Blackpool Pier and described the herring coming to shore, and he said it was 10 miles by 10 miles, a kind of like a huge beast, a single beast trying to lift itself out the water. He said the skies were just full of seabirds diving, and the shoal was surrounded and harried on all sides by tuna and different kinds of sharks and dolphins and the odd whale. And when the shoal moved off, there were 6 feet deep eggs on the seabed, going out from the shore. So the descriptions of kind of the eels migrating down the Severn, where it was as if there was no water in the estuary, just eels, or the Fenlanders' experience of the skies darkening for 2-3 days on end, migrating wading birds and geese and God knows what. We can barely conceive of the abundance that used to be here in Britain and everywhere. And of course, in our own experience, the windscreen splattered with insects, it's become a famous one. So I think people are aware, they have an inkling of what was, but they don't really appreciate it. And a lot of people are so disconnected from nature that if they can see a long way, standing on a Highland glen, not a tree in sight, and they've got poor mobile reception, they think they're in the wild. Or the Cambrian Plateau in central Wales, one of the most ecologically devastated landscapes in all of Europe, they think it's wild. A field of wheat, a plantation of Sitka spruce. But I think that is changing, and the best way it changes is by doing and by bringing people into connection with it, which is what the National Trust, the Woodland Trust and others are doing. I think I stood at Knepp in the spring next to a guy who said to me, it's strange, he said, this is the Knepp Wildland Project in Sussex, and we had storks above our heads and scrub and birdsong and trees. He said, it's strange, this doesn't feel like England. And Charlie Burrell wheeled around and said, no, England doesn't feel like England. This is what England can feel like. So I think the most important thing we can do is bring people into connection with nature, and that's particularly the Department of Education enabling pupils to get out, as they do in Sweden or France or Spain, pupils to get out not just for an hour, one afternoon a year, but to do forest schooling on a regular basis and just to sit and feel nature around them. We have Epping Forest, we have Hainault Forest, we have Dagenham Marshes, loads of places just around the city of London where I live that could accommodate lots of children and MPs. To experience nature, and then the yearning will find its direction.
Absolutely, thank you so much, Ben. And then the final question from me, I will pose to Hilary and Abby, is you're more than welcome also to touch upon the access to nature point, but you've both mentioned some of the successes of the previous government, and I think there are a lot, especially when it comes to nature. But we do have 5-6 years, whichever year it is these days, until the target reaches its end. What do you think is standing in the way of us meeting our nature targets for 2030? Hilary, I'll come to you first.
I genuinely do think there's this issue, I mentioned it earlier, about the farming community, and the reason I am focusing on them because they do have the biggest opportunity to make the biggest change fastest. And actually, and Abby referred to it, particularly in the landscape recovery programme, where you have the biggest opportunity for nature recovery, and actually you're supporting the farmers who are the most marginal and the most, struggling the most. That is where we could make the biggest difference most quickly. That doesn't require any change of anything other than a will to get on with it. And I would just reiterate that there is a time urgency thing here. We do need to bring people with us, and we're all working fiercely hard to try to do that. But I do actually think there needs to be a bit of a leap of faith, and actually said there will be parts of the country that need to be transformed. And so, to Ben's point, I genuinely think we need a much more ambitious and determined push forward within the framework that we already have. It doesn't require any new legislation or anything to slow us up. Just get on with it.
I'll just add perhaps integration across mainstreaming across all parts of government, I think, and all parts of society. I think we have a tendency, even in the environment movement, we do it. We talk about for trees and for wildlife, for people and for wildlife. Actually, we need to integrate how we think, how we talk, how we act. And we saw, even though, health and harmony, that we saw setting the direction for public funding for farming and our landscapes, it didn't follow through into then we saw things not being integrated into, for example, the LURB, levelling up and urban regeneration. Exactly. There was an opportunity to connect up the local nature recovery strategies, and funding for that into the levelling up agenda wasn't taken by the last Tory government. So I think there's a real, also in terms of building nature and restoration of nature into the health agenda and bringing it into that is so vital. But also, us talking about and thinking about and advocating for the economic case for why restoring and the recovery of nature is so vital. It is fundamental to our societal well-being and our economic well-being for the future. I think that's something we've all got to get better at.
Thank you. That's enough questions from me, so I'll now hand over to you all. Please raise your hand and a member of the team will come. I'll start with Alyssa on the very front row.
Alyssa Swinglers from Herefordshire Council, Cabinet Member for the Environment. One of the things that's very front and centre in my work is the state of the River Wye. And possibly one of the most inspiring things that happened was that the level of care and that people have for this river has resulted in a cohort of about 500 active citizen scientists who are testing the river. We have got an incredible wealth of data now, starting from a very low base because of the restrictions of EA funding. So what is the role of citizen science as a way of engaging communities and getting people to really buy into their environment in a really active way to protect it?
Thank you. Who else would like to ask a question? The lady in the pink shirt.
Hello, yes, Theresa. I'm a mathematician living in Cambridge. So since COVID period, we have seen a rapid movement towards remote working, and people were trying to move out of big cities and kind of in suburbs and other places. And there are predictions that because of artificial intelligence, there will be quite huge job losses, but not in 2025, but also in 2026. At the same time, people of my specialization, like mathematicians and computer scientists, many of them are self-employed. It means that kind of a massive changing landscape of employment. I'm wondering, do we actually know what people would need from environment, from their housing, and could we massively challenge labor for not understanding what their workers need and what their workers yearn? But one of the possibilities for conservatives then would be probably replanning also kind of less usual properties like former industrial properties, because sometimes people also are fine with less conventional housing if it's in kind of a nice place, for example. Yes.
Thank you. And then the third question, I don't know who to choose. The lady on the second row, please.
Thank you very much. Prerna Bharadwaj, Mayor of Gerrards Cross and Chair of the Gerrards Cross Town Council. I just wanted to know is what we could do as Conservatives to stop using harmful pesticides such as glyphosate. We've managed to ban it in the Gerrards Cross Town Council, but it's still used at a Bucks and a county level. And I mean, it's been known as a carcinogen, it's harmful.
Glyphosate.
Do we? But it's a known carcinogen and it's harmful for children and animals. So
Stop the internet.
You can stop the internet.
So I was just wondering, what can we do to look at alternatives and have support from the Conservative Environment Network to do that?
Sure. So the first question on the role of citizen scientists. Ben, I wonder if you'd like to begin.
I mean, I think it's marvellous. I think getting people into the environment, participating in whatever way, volunteering, planting trees, walking, taking their kids out, picnicking, just being in nature and interacting daily with nature, as farmers are lucky enough to do. There are no more nature-connected people in the country than farmers. For the rest of us, we're really suffering from, I think, nature deficit disorder, which is a term coined by the author Richard Louv, who wrote the seminal book, Last Child in the Woods, which sought to awaken America and the whole West to the harm we were doing children by not bringing them into contact with nature. So for me, the greater understanding of the pollution of the Wye is a wonderful secondary benefit. And I think the primary thing we need to be doing as a society is bringing ourselves into much closer communion with the natural world. So I'm all for it.
Thank you. Abby, I wondered if you could answer that as well and perhaps touch upon the pesticide point if you can.
Yes, I will. Yes, at Woodland Trust we've got several citizen science projects, really important part of our way of engaging people. Tree planting definitely, but things like Nature's Calendar, which has been a long-standing piece of citizen science, not started by us, but over 3 decades. where we see engagement is increasing year on year across all ages and backgrounds. So I think it is. We've also got the Ancient Tree Inventory, which is a volunteer-based, trying to build the data set about where our ancient veteran trees are. And in actual fact, with a view to that being an important data set and hopefully protecting it through things like the planning system and other decision-making processes. So I would absolutely agree. I think it is a key way. I think we have to think imaginatively about how do we then utilise that data and bring it into decision-making. How do we share it with things like the Environment Agency and then do advocacy together to ensure that some of the processes and decision-making at some of the agencies take this into account. So it'd be great to see some of this data that's coming out of the Y. On glyphosate, my understanding, a number of councils have sought to ban it, and have then, in a number of places, have had to backtrack because they've then suffered problems in terms of people living in and around places seeing the weeds growing and considering that it's messy and the council's not properly looking after the place. So there's a thing around, it goes back to what Ben was talking about in terms of shifting baselines about what nature-rich and wildlife-rich looks like. It's actually a bit messier than people think it is. So there is an education and a taking communities with us and explaining. I think there's a vital role for councils and anyone. I mean, ourselves, we have a large estate in interpreting and explaining and taking people with us about what we're doing and why. Sometimes, of course, when we're restoring a plantation on ancient woodland site, which means chopping down some trees, it means dropping down some maybe Sitka spruce on an ancient woodland site to try and restore the native woodland. It cannot come across well. So we have to work really hard. I would urge any council thinking about doing what you're doing is to think about the communications really proactively.
Ben, I wondered if you wanted to quickly follow up.
Yeah, I just wanted, on the glyphosate point, something amusing and quite touching has happened in the last 2-3 months in Camden, where I live in North London. Someone has been with a little chalk writing the name of the weeds growing through the cracks in the pavement. And apparently this is a phenomenon. I hadn't seen it on social media, but toad flax or common poppy or whatever have started appearing, which is quite nice. If you're walking children to school, you can point out these plants that have been. So I don't know who's doing it, but I'm told it's this urban gardening or urban plant spotting is a thing.
There we go. Hilary, would you like to come in?
Guerrilla gardening, sorry, yes.
So the Trust, we have about 40,000 volunteers, which is a wonderful number. Some of them do, of course, volunteer in our wonderful houses, but actually the growing number is environment. And what's really noticeable there is the age profile. So young people really wanting to get involved, and actually environmental volunteering is something that can be a lot more flexible with, and timing wise people can get it working around their lifestyles. But what I would say is that citizen activism is actually what we're really interested in. So if you think of the water campaign more broadly, the Y is a wonderful example, but if you think of the outpouring of anger across the whole of the country as to what's happening to our water systems generally, that is down to citizen activism. And when you get people to care, then you get politicians to listen. And so we're very supportive of trying to find ways to really care, understand, and then do something about it. So couldn't agree more that that's important. Do you want me to answer any of the other questions?
You're more than welcome to answer the question on challenging what workers want
and the planning
one.
Sorry. Yes, and actually in my opening remarks I didn't refer specifically to the upcoming changes potentially to the planning system, which touches on what you're talking about. Certainly the Trust is really concerned about some of the potential changes that may happen to what has actually over the decades. Actually, the UK are looked on as their planning system has been really robust for many years as a sound planning system. It's not perfect at all. I would make the point that Octavia Hill, the founder of the National Trust, coined the phrase Greenbelt. And so Greenbelt continues to be incredibly important to us. I think we do have to really think creatively about how we ensure that people have access to green space, whether that's in a band, whether that's in a corridor. The point is, do people have quality spaces to live in, whether they're working remotely, whether they're travelling? It's the access to green space, all of the health indicators. It's so clear that people need easy access to quality green space, not a nasty little bit of grass somewhere that doesn't do anything for anybody, but quality green space, which again requires activism to local communities to want to support. But you have to have a planning system that absolutely requires that when you're building new houses, new places to live, you have also built in not just the resilience in terms of flooding and everything else that goes with it, but actual quality to green space, because that is what people need to be able to thrive in a workspace as well as for pleasure.
Theresa, I wondered if you wanted to follow up on the planning point.
Yes, it is true that COVID has changed our lives in many ways. We've already talked about one aspect of that it's reminded people of the wonders of being in nature, and it has inspired a wish to have nature closer to them. And that is one of the many reasons why I am deeply concerned about the idea of building on the green belt, which for many of us is nature on the doorstep. But also, I am concerned about the other impact of COVID is, of course, the extension of remote working, home working that you refer to. And that is changing the way people view their homes. And I think the push by the current government for house building volume to manifest itself as tower blocks and endless flats is the wrong way to go, and we're in real danger of creating the slums of the future. So both for the idea of protecting nature on people's doorsteps, but also building the homes that people want to live in, preferably with some garden space to enjoy, I think both of those are crucial, and on neither of those is the current government going in the right direction. So I hope we as opposition will hold them strongly to account on all of this.
Thank you so much. I'll now turn to some more questions. The man in the grey suit.
Thank you. Chris Lynch, National Trust. Just so you know, this question is not a plant, so I'll direct it at Ben. The panel's talked a lot about the importance of funding arm's length bodies in the agricultural sector, but trying to frame this through a conservative lens, one thing a lot of conservatives believe in is the power of the market and business. What are some policy or political actions that could be taken to boost private investment in nature in the same way that many big businesses now account for and invest in climate mitigation? What could be done to boost nature investment?
Thank you. And next we will have the man in the blue suit with the orange tie.
Tom Lester, House of Lords. I just want to get people to think. It's a bit of a stuck record, this, with the most 10%, the most nature depleted countries in the world. That is through using the Biodiversity Intactness Index, which was created by the Natural History Museum. And that summarises the changes in ecological communities in response to human pressure. So, of course, when Ben was talking about Beatrix Potter and 1 million sheep, now we've got 40 million. We're now at 67, 70 million people, and of course back then there was a lot less. So there's obviously, the more people you have, the less biodiversity or the less nature you have. But if we go to a different metric, which was developed by Yale University, the Environmental Performance Index, the EPI, it's very different. And that, rather than estimate the area of the UK that is natural, they use indices based on habitat intactness. And I'll finish shortly. On this basis, we rank 43rd out of 152, and that's just one of 7 indices. And overall for biodiversity, we rank 23rd out of 180. So it would be great if we could expand our thinking on this, rather than trying to frighten the light out of everybody. And perhaps conservation organisations should be a little more responsible, and we shouldn't beat ourselves up too much about what Britain is doing. We are very much leading the way in many areas.
Thank you. And then the third question for this group, the lady straight ahead in front of me.
Best race. This panel's called Pastures New, and of course pasture has been an important part of the British landscape for well over 2,000 years. I'd be really interested in your perspective on what role pasture might play in a more biodiverse future and how we might protect it.
Thank you. Ben, I'll come to you on the question of private investment as requested by the asker.
Well, Treasuries can this still be heard? So the Treasury, I'm told, is still applying pressure on DEFRA to find ways of encouraging the private sector to invest in the recovery of nature, recognising the obligations that the government's under to meet a bunch of nature recovery targets, and recognising that public finances are constrained and the amount of philanthropic money available is limited. So that's good news, and there are a bunch of markets that are appearing in the UK that, to me, make perfect sense. The most obvious ones are around hydrology. Now, the greatest threat to the power grid in this country is not a lack of power generation, it's the flooding of substations. So developing natural solutions to prevent or reduce the frequency of the flooding of electricity substations, food logistics hubs, airports and so on, network rail, makes real sense. And so the growth in natural flood management payments, and which are used to incentivize the creation of wetlands and the rewetting of peat bogs and the restoration of mosaics of rainforests and so on the edge of Dartmoor, this makes real sense, and the money is now flowing. So I think but there are still obstacles. Ofwat still has an issue with the water companies applying nature work as capital investment, and so that needs fixing. And similarly, the Environment Agency is constrained as to how much of its capital budget it can spend on nature versus concrete, even though the nature seems to offer a much less definable, but arguably a much greater bang for your buck. So I think water is a pretty good place to start, and the UK is doing a good job on that, and other countries are way ahead of us. From Pakistan to Uganda, they now understand that if you strip the hills of nature, you get more flash flooding. Similarly, biodiversity credits, the regulated market in biodiversity credits, is modelled upon the United States federal wetlands banking market. And it works. The US has added something like 1 million acres of new wetlands since 1995 because of that legislation, and we've more or less copied it with our biodiversity credits. I think talking about offsets it complicates things. I think really what this is it's a bit of a tax. It's persuading private sector organizations who want to build stuff that they have to put a bit of money into nature if they want permission to do so from society. So I think we have an interesting template in biodiversity credits, and there's also a voluntary market emerging in biodiversity credits as well. Now, how that will relate to the voluntary market in carbon credits and to what extent those two will become one, or which way it will go, is at the moment unclear. But for sure, it's a helpful thing if companies like Microsoft or Google want to invest in the restoration of nature and put it in their annual report as their contribution in the form of biodiversity or carbon credits. So I think these are all things that we need to be encouraging rather than crowding out or standing in the way of. And I think the risks are greater of that happening under a Labour government than a Conservative one, because it's not really in the DNA of the Labour Party, I think, to rely on private market mechanisms to solve societal problems. So that's where I think the government needs to be held to account, or we need to be watched very closely by the opposition, because Conservatives tend to understand the use of such mechanisms to fix problems. So I think we're in an exciting period, and I think I just want to give credit to Tom Lester, who's one of the great champions of nature recovery in this country. Anyone who's been lucky enough to visit Norfolk or who's read about the things that are happening on his enormous estate, where they're producing food, creating jobs, and creating burgeoning nature recovery in a number of different ways, really will know what I'm talking about. And he's right, we are a leader. You know, we don't export stuff like we used to, we don't manufacture in the way that we used to, but we do still export ideas. If you move to Abu Dhabi or Beijing and you want your child to go to school, most likely it's a British school that has franchised there. If you look at the legislative book of many countries, you'll find things that have been transcribed straight from British law. You know, we do put out ideas, and I think that the UK is leading the way in showing how you harness the power of markets in conjunction with well thought through government funded schemes to restore nature. And so I really hope that continues, and I hope that we can offer a way for bigger places like the EU and the US and Australia to follow.
Theresa, would you like to come in on that point on the Conservative case for private markets for nature?
Yes, there's so much potential here. I very much agree with what Ben's already said, and he's covered the crucial thing. But what we need is people to be confident that if they invest in a biodiversity credit, then that is genuinely delivering a result. I think one of the problems at the moment is there are lots of sort of offset or credit schemes, and people aren't necessarily confident that they're genuinely going to make a difference environmentally. And we are making tremendous progress on that, and the whole biodiversity net gain thing coming into operation will, I hope, accelerate that. But I think there is, as I've said, we have reason to be optimistic that those principles could have a genuinely transformational impact. And in doing that, we're delivering them via a market mechanism which accords with our conservative principles. So I think we should be optimistic. And there is, of course, the parallel with climate change and carbon, with companies also wanting to focus on sustainability in that arena as well. And naturally enough, schemes to support nature can have a tremendous impact in helping people make their sustainability commitments on climate as well.
Thank you so much. Hilary, I'll come to you next on the point around quantifying nature and how we can also take the wins, and perhaps also if you could touch upon the question on the role of pastures.
So I completely agree with you, actually, and again, I was in a session yesterday, particularly the Conservative community don't like to be hectored, don't like to be told that you've done something wrong, that you've got something, that you should be punished for something. So I think definitely positive intent is a much more effective tool, actually, to want to get people engaged. So yes, they can recognise the threat, but actually to feel that you can do something about it is the more important impetus. So I completely agree with you. I think there has been, to be fair, a desire to make people waken up and realise, because of this issue of the sort of the changing baseline, people don't realise there's a problem, and particularly the younger generation, and particularly people living in cities, actually don't think there's a problem. So if you don't know the problem, then you don't know that you need to act. So there is a balance here, but I absolutely agree that we can and should be proud, and particularly, as I said in my opening remarks, in terms of the legacy that this party has had in getting the foundations of the thinking right, there is much to celebrate. But unless I'm passionate about needing to get the entire community to understand there is a problem and I can do something about it, and I can activate myself and my community to make a difference. For me, there is a self-responsibility thing here that absolutely goes to the heart of conservative thinking. I can make a difference.
Shall I jump in? I would agree with everything Hilary's just said, and I think it's a good challenge. It is always our challenge about how do you create that sense of jeopardy and urgency to drive change. But equally, there are great things. There's success, and hearing about success and how to do it, and learning from others. Successes is always a way that you energise and can influence others to do. On the pasture, I mean, in actual fact, we're big. I know I work. You're probably not expecting me to talk about pasture, but because I work for the Woodland Trust, but wood pasture. And really beautiful biodiverse wood pasture is one of those really precious habitats that we'd love to see more of. Trees, big old trees within wood pasture are at risk, and we did some interesting work in the east of England, in Suffolk, that showed that since utilising old maps, that trees outside woods, so these small groups of old trees or singular trees in the rural landscape, we've lost about 50% of them in that eastern Claylands landscape through neglect. They're just taken for granted. They're not protected. Farming, maybe farming up to the roots, livestock compressing the soil underneath. So really looking after those big old trees in our rural landscapes. We did a wonderful bit of work with a number of farmers throughout the UK celebrating the living legends that they have on their farm. And I know, El Lester, you've got quite a lot of living legends on your estate in East Anglia. So yeah, more wood pasture would be wonderful. But pasture with or without trees, meadows, so high biodiversity meadows. But that's all about stripping the nutrients out of it, isn't it? But yeah, it's definitely got an important place as far as we're concerned.
And just my penny's worth on that. So I completely agree. Of course, pasture is going to be very important. But if we've got limited amounts of money and we've got limited amounts of time, I would be encouraging whichever shade of government to prioritise first where your biggest opportunity is. And I have to say, for me, in terms of nature recovery, the uplands have to come first. And I would say in terms of carbon and all of the restoration challenges around that, I would say lowland peat is probably where I would go next. But pasture will, of course, be important, and that is where we need to get the farming community really engaged on why and what differences it can make, as you quite rightly say, soil being where you start. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's now 11:30, so with that I will close this panel event. Thank you all so much for attending. Thank you to our panellists for taking part, and a big thank you to the Woodland Trust and National Trust for sponsoring this panel event. Stay in the room, and there will be an event coming up at 12 o'clock. I can't remember what it is, though.